So good evening, everyone, and welcome to Glacier Book Club. My name is Glacier Regala, and I am the Executive Assistant for the Glacier Conservancy and have the exciting job of being your host tonight. I'm joined by my amazing coworkers, Geneva and Andrew, who will be helping with technology and monitoring the chat. So feel free to drop any questions you have for our author in the chat. We have a great program for you all tonight. I have giveaway prizes as usual. And I have lots of questions for the author, but as I mentioned, please throw your questions in the chat as well. For those of you that are book club regulars, you may be wondering where Doug and Amy are, but do not fret. They are safe and healthy, just taking this book club off to be with family as it's kind of fallen in that spring break timeline. But it gave me the incredible opportunity to host tonight's book club and discuss one of the most thought-provoking books I've read in a while, Tenacious Beasts, Wildlife Recoveries That Change How We Think About Animals, with the author, Dr. Christopher Preston. Dr. Preston is an award-winning author, public speaker, and environmental philosopher based in Missoula, Montana, where he teaches at the University of Montana. He grew up in England, but moved to the US at 22, where he has spent time in Colorado, Alaska, Oregon, Washington, D.C., and South Carolina before ending up in the Big Sky State for longer than Andrew, Geneva, or I had been in Montana as well. So that was kind of fun to find out. He has a BA from the University of Durham in the UK, an MA from Colorado State University, and a PhD from the University of Oregon. We are very lucky to have Dr. Preston joining Glacier Book Club, as his work has appeared in some perhaps more prestigious outlets such as the Atlantic, BBC, Smithsonian, and Wall Street Journal, but he is of course a member of our Glacier Book Club now. And today we will be discussing his most recent book, Tenacious Beasts, which has been awarded a spot on the New Yorker's Best Books of 2023 list and was in the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's Wild Read for February 2024. Prior to that, he wrote the award-winning Synthetic Age of Designing Evolution, Resurrecting Species, and Re-engineering Our World, which is a book about the replacement of the natural world with technology. Dr. Preston, welcome to Glacier Book Club.
Thank you so much, Gracie. And this is a prestigious outlet. I'm very happy to be here.
I'm glad we're very lucky to have you. I just kind of wanted to start off by asking what exactly is environmental philosophy? It sounds super interesting, and I feel like I wasn't in college that long ago, but I certainly didn't take any environmental philosophy classes. So how'd you find your way into that world, and how did being in that world lead to writing this book?
Yeah, so it's a good question. What do philosophers do? They think about things, right? What do environmental philosophers do? They think about things in the environment. What could be better than that? So I spend my time thinking about our surroundings and trying to sort of, I guess what philosophers do is they try and put angles on how we think about our surroundings, how we think about the world. And they ask, are we doing this the right way? Are we doing this in a way that's out of date? Is there a different way to look at things? And so, there's a lot going on environmentally in terms of climate change and biodiversity loss. And so part of my job as an environmental philosopher is just to try and figure out the most productive, the most useful way to think about our surroundings.
Awesome. Yeah, I find it very interesting. And I think it makes sense that you kind of were led to think about wildlife because as you kind of talked about in the book, there's a lot of sort of doom and gloom feelings with environmental situations, but there's a lot of hope when you learn about wildlife. And one of the things I found super interesting, maybe it's my Minnesota background, not growing up near the ocean, but all the stuff about whales I thought was so interesting. Specifically, you talked about kind of the amount of nutrients that whales carry and how they help circulate that, which was mind-blowing for me. I also listened to you on a podcast and you mentioned there was kind of a relationship with that whale nutrients and kind of the melting glaciers and the nutrients we're losing through that. Can you talk a little bit about what whales can do for the environment and the relationship they have to glaciers?
Sure. So, I grew up on the ocean, but I grew up in England. When I first came out to the United States, I was studying environmental philosophy in Colorado, and I heard the thing to do in the summer is to go to Alaska. So that first summer, I hitchhiked a ride up to Alaska. I dropped off at a place called Toke Junction. Some of you might know where that is, and I stuck my thumb out at Toke Junction, ended up in Valdez. And from that summer on, and many summers afterwards, I was out on the water working in the commercial fishing industry. And the sorts of wildlife you could see on the water in Alaska. I mean, I started in Prince William Sound. It just blew my mind that there were these enormous animals, these enormous charismatic animals, whether they were Steller sea lions or harbor seals or killer whales or humpback whales, just out there in their profusions. And so when I started writing this book, going to Alaska was totally a no-brainer. That was something that I really wanted to do. And I'd kind of caught wind of the fact that whale recovery was potentially providing these benefits for the ecosystem. And so I went up to Juneau and hung out with a marine ecologist called Heidi Pearson, who the comment that she made about glaciers, which sort of stuck with me, is that she's driving by the Mendenhall Glacier every day to go to work. And those glaciers typically provide nutrients into those bays and those ocean ecosystems as they're slowly moving, and they're always melting a little bit of water. But then as the glacier retreats, the amount of nutrients that are going to end up in the bays is going to diminish. And eventually, if the glacier disappears, there's going to be no nutrients ending up in the bays at all. That's obviously bad for the system. But at the same time, we've got this recovery of these whales, which are providing their own little boost in terms of nutrients through their fecal matter, where they feed and where they poop, basically. So the whales are playing a role in this nutrient system. The glacier's role in this nutrient system is changing as well. Initially, when they start melting, they're going to be pouring a lot of water into the bays, and they're going to be pumping a lot of nutrients in there. But then as they retreat, they're going to be pumping less. And so, where this is ultimately heading is kind of difficult to tell, but there's interesting interactions going on there, and it's an interesting time to be studying that stuff.
Yeah, it's super, super interesting. I felt like the thought that, not only did stopping whaling help carbon and more nutrients because we weren't taking these big commercial boats out, but also that the whales themselves carry and distribute nutrients was just really, really amazing to me. Another big animal you talked about was the wolf. A little more controversial, perhaps, because it was really once despised by a lot of the human population. But in the book, you spoke to a lot of different wolf supporters and friends, including a friend of Glacier Park, Diane Boyd, who was, I think, in the North Fork, or maybe even still is for a while, studying wolves, and was even featured in an episode of the Glacier podcast, Headwaters. But this kind of support of wolves is now spanning a lot wider than just with biologists like Diane, sometimes even with kind of community volunteers in the case of this wiki wolves idea you talked about in the book. Can you talk a little bit about the complications that arise with cohabitation that's kind of required with wolves a lot of times, and how we didn't really have that before, and then how it can birth something as kind of cool and community engaging as that Wiki Wolves program?
So wolves are always going to be difficult. They're so symbolic. And I don't know why particularly wolves are symbolic, but maybe it's because they're so smart, because they live in families, because they're loyal. Maybe because they're related to domestic dogs. We have this, maybe the canids, we have this love-hate relationship with them. We love the ones that are in our front room, and we hate the ones that come out of the wilderness and take our sheep or our cattle or something like that. So wolves are always going to be complicated. But I think there's sort of lessons to learn from Europe. So I started the wolf chapter in Europe. Europe's fascinating because wolves are back in every country in continental Europe, and none of them have been reintroduced. So they've talk about a tenacious beast. They've come back because basically we stopped killing them. We stopped killing them, and they came back. The only country in which they're not back in Europe is the UK, my home country. And 2 weeks ago, there was a book released about wolves in the UK. And so I think that conversation is starting to happen even in the UK. But what Europeans are figuring out is that if you're gonna make cohabitation work, you've got to have you've got to have everybody's skin in the game. You can't have wolves come back and then people watch them come back from the safety of the city and just expect the people who are bearing the costs just to kind of eat up those costs. And so in Europe, what's happening is people from the cities are going into those rural environments and helping the farmers to cope with the problem. And they're making it clear also, I think this is a really important point, making it clear that the identity of those farmers is one that they respect. They're not sort of saying, hey, wolves are here now, deal with it. They're saying you need to be compensated. If we have time on the weekend, we're going to go out there and we're going to help you. And they're showing that it's a communal problem. It's not a problem that just falls on certain sets of shoulders. And I think that's a good kind of rubric for cohabitation with any animal that's difficult to cohabit with. You got to be super careful if you're in favor of these reintroductions and these animal recoveries. You got to be super careful not to diminish the experience of the people for whom those recoveries and reintroductions are difficult. And I think that's something we can maybe get better at here in the Rocky Mountain West. And I think another element of this is to be clear-eyed about the scope of the problem, and sometimes the scope of the problem is exaggerated. And since I wrote the book, I worked on a little article about wolves in Colorado and the reintroduction in Colorado, and I started looking up numbers to compare predation, and I found the numbers on wolf predation on cattle in Montana. And according to the Montana Bureau of Livestock, every year, 0.0016 of Montana's cattle population are taken by wolves. 0.0016 is a surprisingly small number when you think about how much of the sort of public discourse wolf and wolf predation, how much space that takes up in the public discourse. So, there's two things I said there. One is we've got to be super serious about recognizing that this is a shared problem that we've all got to work on and all got to have skin in the game. But the other thing I said is we've also got to be clear-eyed about exactly what the scale of the problem is and how much political space it takes up.
Definitely, and I think that they even kind of are related there in that people are going to feel more heard in the problem if they know that people are understanding and working together on it, that it's a community thing. It's not just you lost a few cows, but it's that it's the community thing. That's really interesting and kind of wonderful to look at the sort of cohabitation abilities that cohabiting with wildlife can even help us interact better as our own species. In that same vein, you have talked about there's this distinction between ecological carrying capacity and social carrying capacity, and how how do we even find this balance? What do you think is the importance of looking at both of those things and finding that balance, and how much does it even vary?
Yeah, sure. So just to explain the difference between the two, the ecological carrying capacity is how many of a certain species a landscape can sustain. So if none of them were being killed by humans, how many wolves, for example, could a certain environment support? The social carrying capacity is usually going to be lower than the ecological carrying capacity, because that's how many of a certain species can the society tolerate. And often the society cannot tolerate as many as the ecosystem can sustain. So often the social carrying capacity is going to be lower than the ecological carrying capacity. For a long time in many parts of America, the social carrying capacity for wolves was zero. We weren't okay with having wolves on our landscapes. And what we've seen, which I think for those who love animals, what we've seen over the last few decades is that social carrying capacity kind of going up, which is good. And depending on how much you love animals, you might want to try and get that social carrying capacity as close as you can to the ecological carrying capacity. And you do that by putting time and money and energy into these efforts at cohabitation that we were just talking about. You know, if you make that cohabitation easier, and if you make it easier for the people who suffer the cost of that cohabitation, then you can perhaps bring that social carrying capacity up and then see just how far it can go.
Yeah, yeah, that's amazing. And it's interesting how kind of the social carrying capacity is then how much our human ecosystem is ready and capable of taking, which is something that's just kind of interesting to think about and consider. I have one more question before I will turn it over to Geneva to ask some of the audience questions. So keep putting those in the chat if you have them. But before I ask that question, I want to let everyone know that Dr. Preston has agreed to signing book plates for anyone that is interested. If you want a book plate, if you could email info@glacier.org. Since I'm hosting today, I won't be able to as closely monitor the chat, and I don't want anyone who wants a book plate to miss it. So if you're interested in receiving a signed book plate from Dr. Preston, please email info@glacier.org. All right. I have this one more question before we see what the questions in the chat have been, but you had so many different kind of animal recovery stories, even more than the animals that are pictured on the cover of the book. What's the story for you that didn't make the book?
So those of you who've looked at the book know I organize it kind of by landscape. You know, I have farmland, I have prairie, rivers, forests. I was going to have cities. I thought that cities would be fascinating, and I thought that the animals that recover in cities would have particularly important lessons to teach us. Because a lot of these chapters have cohabitation kind of threaded in there somewhere. And surely you can't go to a better place than a city and figure out how to cohabit with animals if we can do it there. And I actually wrote a peregrine falcon chapter, and I was super happy about that. And then I was trying to get in touch with a fox expert in the UK, because a lot of cities in England are just full of foxes, red foxes. London's got them absolutely everywhere. It's just bizarre. You kind of walk down a street in a very dense urban area, and there'll be a fox just kind of trotting along the sidewalk or walking along the top of a brick wall or something like that. And I was in the process of getting in touch with an urban fox expert when I kind of realized how big the book was becoming already. And I wondered if I do my little sections in chapters of 3. So I wondered if 3 city chapters was gonna kind of push the book too far over the top. And so I made the decision to leave out the cities. section. But I do have this great peregrine falcon chapter that I kind of want to do something with.
Oh, that is awesome. As someone who grew up in a city, I think that would be really interesting. I think we don't really think about wildlife in the city all the time, and yeah, that would be awesome. So if you ever end up doing something, let us know. I think that would be very interesting. But I think I'll give some time to Geneva and the questions from the chat.
Yeah, we've got a couple questions here. So I'll start with one from Lisa. How did you decide which animals to spotlight in your book?
I kind of have an embarrassing answer to this question. So I hope you'll tolerate the embarrassing answer. I didn't write this book on a sort of travel budget provided by any organization. I wrote it on the basis of experiences that I had had through my work as a philosophy professor. And I guess I also kind of wrapped in some sort of biographical elements, one of which I think you might, if you noticed in the chapter on the bison in England, I got to know the story about bison in England because my sister happens to live a few miles from where these bison have been reintroduced. So that was because of my sort of family dynamic. And when I go visit England, I go visit this part of England, and that's a species that I learned was recovering there. One of the, you might remember the first humpback whales I encountered, they're in northern Norway in a place called Tromsø, which is way up at the top in the Arctic in Norway. And I have a research project that I've been involved in up there in Tromsø, which is actually to do with agriculture and genetic modification of plants. But when I was up there, I learned about these whales. And so this is to say that the species that I chose were the ones that I'd sort of encountered through family stuff and through work stuff, research stuff, and through, going to Alaska in the summers. And then there were a few where I'd heard there was interesting things going on. So the northern spotted owl and the barred owl controversy in the state of Washington and Oregon and British Columbia. That was something I'd heard, and it was relatively close to me here in Missoula. So I was able to make a trip out in that direction. I'd always wanted to go see the dam removal sites on the Elwha River in Olympic National Park. That was just kind of a dream I had. I just wanted to be there and see this recovery. And again, that wasn't too far for me to go. So it was kind of a haphazard thing where, when I thought about it, I thought, wow, I've got like 15 or 20 species here that I've run into over the last few years that I could write something about. And that's how it came together. But I'd love to, there's plenty of others I'd love to go out there and chase down and look at for sure. Because really, I'm just scratching the surface of what there is to say here.
Yeah, that's awesome. Makes perfect sense. And a follow-up question from Lisa, how long did it take you to do all the traveling and information gathering?
I'd say 2 to 3 years. I've written a handful of books, and I think it's tough to write a book in less than 2 years. And especially if you are traveling to see, if you've got particular destinations in mind that you want to go to, it starts to spill over beyond that. So yeah, it's certainly 2 to 3 years, maybe more if you think about where the first experience was with one of these stories. So actually there's a little anecdote about a fish hatchery in there. And that was more like 10 or more years ago. It's still kind of crisp in my mind, but yeah, it's a compilation of experiences over time.
Very cool. Let's see here. We have a question from Eric and Tanya. They say the reception for the return of wolves in Europe seems starkly different from the reception in the US. Are there any lessons that can be transferred from there to here?
So that's a good question. I don't want to give the impression that in Europe nobody is concerned about the recovery of wolves. So very, very recently, the situation is actually changing at the moment because wolf numbers have recovered enough that the sort of need to bring it back from local extinction or near extinction, that need is going away. There's about 17,000 wolves in Europe at the moment. And the discussion of how to start keeping a lid on the wolf population is just beginning in Europe. And so this is actually kind of another interesting phase of all of this. If Europe returns to the killing of wolves, then how are they going to do that? And how are they going to judge those limits? But for the original question here, like how come it's going so well over there? One of the things I would say is from the EU, you had a very strong central commitment that these wolves had to be allowed to come back. The nature and animal recovery laws in Europe are such that all the native species in Europe have the right, if you like, to come back onto those landscapes, and member states have to do what they can to facilitate that. And then with that is funding, so that that can happen as smoothly as possible. And so EU countries give funds to prepare farmers and ranchers to deal with wolves. And hardening your farm against the arrival of wolves is something that each of the member states will pay for you to do. So it went well because there was this commitment to it coming at a very high level, with funding to support it, and with citizens who were willing, as I was saying earlier, to put skin in the game. So I think that there were a few things that meant that it went a little bit better initially, but it's not, I would be being misleading if I said it's not without some problems. You see on the news sometimes a lot of French sheep farmers are getting increasingly upset about wolf predation on sheep in France. But I want to drop a little statistic for you just to contemplate at the end of this answer here. So Italy is 4/5 of the land area of Montana. So it's a big-ish place, but it's not bigger than Montana. It has 60 million people in it, and it has 3 times the number of wolves that we have in Montana. And every time I think about that statistic, I think it's kind of incredible to imagine how with 60 million people, you can have 3 times the wolves that we've got in Montana. So there is something that's going right in Europe about wolf recovery.
Wow, yeah, that's a really incredible statistic. Okay, a question from Gretchen. She commented that one point that really struck her was the comparison of the argument for genetically pure bison to the blood quantum required for Indigenous tribal membership. Do you find that there's a growing attention to Indigenous knowledge in wildlife management?
There is, and it's a good time for this to happen. Obviously, the sort of history of the environmental movement in the United States, going back to people like John Muir, Theodore Roosevelt, was not one that was very sympathetic to the presence of Indigenous people on the landscape, nor the knowledge that Indigenous people have about living on a landscape and sharing a landscape. One of the things that I found in writing this book is that when species that have previously been wiped out or nearly wiped out, when they come back, the hardest challenge is the social challenge of cohabitation. And so if you want to figure out the social challenge of cohabitation, you might as well talk to people who have cohabited with these species for thousands of years. It kind of makes sense that you would want to talk to those with a long history of cohabitation to sort of hear what the ideas are. And I guess there's 2 ways to think about this. One way would be, okay, hear what the practical strategies are for cohabiting. And, you know, that's true. It's important to, what do you have to do practically to share a landscape? But a second way to think about it, and here's the philosopher in me coming out a bit, a second way to think about it is, what are the changes in ideas that we need in order to successfully cohabit with a wildlife species? Like, how do we have to think about that species differently? And since, Gracie, you asked about the whales earlier on, and the whales' role in ocean fertilization and carbon sequestration, some of you might remember that in that chapter of the book, I said, when you think about how much a whale is contributing to the ecosystem and to the carbon sequestration in that ecosystem, you might start thinking about the whale as a partner or an ally. Because, you know, we got a carbon problem, we've got to figure out ways to deal with it. And if it's the case that whales are helping us deal with it by creating these phytoplankton blooms, then the whale is an ally, right? And a partner and a helpful being to have on your climate team, if you like. And so these ideas of partnership, obviously they resonate with indigenous ways of interacting with animals. And this was something that kind of emerged for me in the book. You know, I didn't set out to write a book that tracked indigenous relationships with animals, but that's actually what I found with several of the species, is that kind of emerged out of what I was learning.
Very neat. Yeah, on the topic of partnership, we have another question from Bethany about how you feel about so many conservation organizations working on similar, I guess, missions. How do you feel about these organizations, and do you feel that they are working as efficiently as they could together based on your experience and your research, and how could they improve by teaming up or partnering, so to speak?
So did I miss at the start of that question, which particular conservation organizations are we talking about?
None in particular. She just says, as I hear about the phenomenal work of so many conservation organizations, how do you think they could work together, team up more effectively?
Yeah, interesting question. There's sort of a politics around conservation, isn't there? And you know, some organizations want to be the most hardline and extreme on some areas, and others are better at kind of working across some different priorities. I think I mean, it's obviously going to be helpful to find, you know, what's the core common thing that a set of conservation organizations want to do. And if you can sort of state that and establish that that's a common goal, then it seems like that gives you a starting place from which to find solutions that you can all work on. And what I'm thinking about here, for example, is if you were it wouldn't make a difference if you were interested in conserving a wildlife species or a stream for stream health. You'd both want to make sure that your riparian area was healthy. You know, you'd both want to make sure that the land that immediately surrounded the waterways was vegetated with native vegetation and not polluted with runoff, for example, because getting that one piece right is going to be good both for the creek and for the wildlife species, because those riparian areas are obviously kind of gold mines for biodiversity. And so I think there's sort of smart strategies you can develop by finding where the common ground is and where the win-wins are. And then sort of trying to avoid the sort of extreme stances that sometimes can get in the way of collaboration. You know, I'm not, the world I'm in actually is not the world of conservation politics. It's more the world of conservation ideas. But I hear from my friends who are in that world of conservation politics that sometimes they're tearing their hair out that they can't get along with the other conservation organizations. So I would definitely like to see more more finding of common ground, more finding of win-wins, because a lot of people are really ultimately heading or aiming for the same goal here.
For sure, for sure. Cool. Okay. Another one from Eric and Tanya. They comment, the question of bison genetic purity is very interesting. Isn't having the animals better than genetic purity? Sorry, this question is split up here. Isn't having the animals at all better than genetic purity, even with bovine genes?
Yeah, this is a super interesting question. It's one that I'm still really kind of interested in. So when I wrote the book, it was thought that there was still bison in North America that were entirely free from cattle genes. A scientific paper published since I wrote the book says that's no longer true. There's no bison in North America completely pure of cattle genes. And I called up the professors who wrote that paper just to kind of talk through it. And I wrote a story about it for Discover magazine. And one of them said, I said, what did it feel like to you when you learned that there's no bison left in North America that's completely pure of cattle genes? And he said, I got to tell you, it was a huge disappointment. I've been working on this. I've been sort of holding out for this for 30 years. And now I realize that I can't hold out for it any longer. But then he said, the bison is still a remarkable animal. And he said, I'm still delighted that we've got these animals. And so he'd been able to turn his slight disappointment into excitement about the fact they were still here, maybe not genetically the same as they were in the Pleistocene or even the same as they were 500 years ago. But they're still here and they're performing that ecological function. And if the animal is still here performing that function, you've got to recognize that that's a win. And if I can just make a quick connection to Europe here, I was over in Europe recently, and I was introduced to an animal called a tauros. And a tauros is a recreated auroch. So an auroch is an extinct European cow, basically, the original wild cow. And they've been gone for 400 years. We know what they're like genetically because they've been genetically sequenced from bones that have been dug up. And we know what they like because they're painted on the walls of caves in France. We know what they look like. The tauros is an animal that has been recreated to mimic the auroch, and it's been done by backbreeding. So they did genetic analysis of a bunch of wild cattle breeds in Europe and said, well, if we mix this one with this one, and then we breed its offspring with this one, we're gonna get slowly and slowly closer to this extinct auroch. And I went and visited these animals, and they're fantastic. They're massive, and they have these huge forward-facing horns. And the expert who I was visiting with said, you wouldn't believe how powerful it is to see these animals regain their native intelligence. He said they're becoming smarter and smarter every day. They're learning these new strategies for coping with the world. They're developing their kind of social bonds. And I said, well, don't you want these things to be genetically pure like the aurochs? And he said, and also this guy, Ronald Godery, who I spoke to for the book, I said, no, we don't care. It doesn't have to be pure. It doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to be functional. And after seeing one of these animals in the flesh, which was just a couple of weeks ago, I kind of get that. There's a real power in an animal, even if the genetics are not pure or whatever that might mean.
That's super fascinating. Okay, a question from our good friend Kay Stone. What was the biggest surprise for you in researching the book? Hers in reading it was the magnitude of the whale pump.
Magnitude of the whale pump. The biggest surprise for me, that's an interesting one. I guess that one of the things that maybe I kind of knew in abstract, but didn't sort of appreciate in concrete, is how quickly species can come back. And this is especially the case with fish, and especially in marine environments. A Chinook salmon, for example, can lay 7,000 eggs. There's species of bass that can lay 2 million eggs. And so if you make it possible for that fish to start breeding again, and you might do this by taking down a dam, you might do it by restoring some habitat, you might do it actually by closing down a part of the ocean to fishing, for example, if it's a species that breeds in the ocean. If you create the conditions in which successful reproduction can happen, you can get these incredible recoveries really quickly. Let me give you an example from, so I mentioned earlier, I think I grew up on the coast, a place called Seaford, which is in Sussex in southern England. And about 3 years ago, they implemented a ban on bottom trawling just off the coast. And it was just a little strip where this ban was put in place. So bottom trawling, as you probably realize, you're dragging a heavy net along the bottom of the ocean. You're kind of scooping up everything there, and you're destroying the vegetation. You're destroying the kelp. When they put that ban on bottom trawling, the kelp came back almost immediately. And when the kelp comes back, you have this incredible habitat back for fish to breed. And what I've heard is that the trawlers, the people who were made to respect this ban, and actually they signed on to it in the first place. So it wasn't like they were made to accept it kicking and screaming, they signed on to it. But within a year and a half of the ban, they were catching enough fish outside, just outside of the protected area, that they realized the ban was in their interests. And to me, this is sort of astonishing that you can imagine somebody being worried about the trawling ban, complaining about it, fighting it, holding it up for years and years and years. And then it happens. And within literally a matter of 12 or 18 months, the person whose interest you thought would be most negatively impacted is pleased that it's happened because the fish have recovered so quickly. To me, that's a huge lesson for sort of what can be possible if we give it a chance to happen. And within the last 6 months or so, you might have heard this over the news. The United Nations agreed in principle to protect 30% of the oceans from fishing, the high seas. And to me, like having done the research for the book, to me, that's an incredibly exciting development. If you can get fishing out of 30% of the oceans, the spillover from all of that profuse breeding that's going to take place amongst those fish species is just a very exciting thing, and just sort of full of a wealth of possibilities. So yeah, I think that was maybe one of the big surprises.
That is amazing. Yeah, wow. Geneva, I'll take over for a second here so you can
Okay.
finalize the giveaway winners. Tonight we will be giving away a plush Wolverine and a plush Lynx. These two animals, well, the real animals, not the plush versions, have both been studied in Glacier National Park through Conservancy-funded projects. At the Conservancy, we have the great pleasure of helping fund critical wildlife research in Glacier National Park. These are investments that help preserve biodiversity, promote the abundance of wildlife, and successfully defend against potential threats. So tonight, as we marvel at the amazing ways wildlife can recover at the drop of a hat, we just noted, join us if you can in supporting wildlife in Glacier National Park. If you'd like to join in this important work, please visit the donation page, which will be dropped in the chat in just a moment here, where all donations will be directed towards wildlife projects in the park, like the ones we did involving the lynx and the wolverine. But before Geneva announces the winner, even while Doug's away, I thought I would do the Glacier speed round here. So if you're ready, the category is animal superpowers. So I did things animals can do that humans don't necessarily normally do, but thought it would be fun to see which one you would rather be able to do. Are you ready? All right. Would you rather be able to fly or breathe underwater?
Fly.
Good answer. You can see a whole world of things from up there.
Breathing underwater would be nice too.
Yeah, that's true. Would you rather have to gain 3 pounds a day in preparation for hibernation or work all summer to store enough food to survive the 9-month alpine winter?
I like the idea of gaining 3 pounds a day. I think that would be kind of fun.
Yeah, so a little challenge, right?
Yeah.
All right, so then hibernation or migrating to somewhere warmer in the winter?
Ooh, hibernation. I'm not really a warm weather person, so I think hibernation.
Yeah, you're living in Montana after all, right?
Mhm.
Would you rather be predator or prey?
I'm not sure what's the upside to being prey. I think it would have to be predator.
I think that's fair. When I wrote that one, I was like, would anyone pick prey? But I'm sure there's someone out there that might. And then, would you rather have 4 legs or 2 wings?
Ooh, I mean, flying is a nice superpower, I agree, but it would be hard to give up the legs, I think. So yeah, if you gave me 2 extra legs, I'd be able to get around a bit quicker. So I think I'm going to go for 4 legs.
There you go. And then last one, this one's a little bit sillier, but bobcats or grizzlies?
Do you want me to answer this as a wildlife person or as a university person?
Whichever way you'd like to answer.
Grizzlies.
There you go. Go Grizz. All right, Geneva, if you're ready to announce the giveaway winners.
Yeah, we have 2 winners tonight, one for the Wolverine and one for the Lynx. Our first winner is Lauren Glowacki. I'm sorry if I'm butchering that. And then our second winner is Gary Shea. So if you both would please email Gracie at glacier.org. We'll put it in the chat. We'll get your prizes to you. Thanks for joining us tonight.
Awesome. Very exciting. Geneva, do you have one more question from the chat you'd like to ask?
Yeah, let me see here. We have a couple in here, and I'm sorry if we're not able to answer all of them. We have a question from Maya. You wrote a lot about the benefits and nuances of dam removal and its effect on salmon populations. The removal of the 4 Snake River dams is particularly relevant to Montana. Do you have any perspective on that issue?
Yeah, I mean, so I wrote about the 2 dams that came off the Elwar. Since I wrote that, the 4 dams are coming off the Klamath. Super exciting. That's now the biggest dam removal project in the world. And the Biden administration has recently signed a sort of memorandum, a sort of plan for working with the tribes for salmon on in the Columbia drainage. And it includes consideration of and study of, or it includes an openness to the removal of those 4 Snake River dams. You know, obviously it's a heavy political lift, but having seen what I've seen with salmon removal, seeing what I've seen with dam removal for salmon on the Elwha, you've got to think that if you want to return salmon to the Columbia and Snake, that dam removals has got to be part of that in some form and some fashion. And it's extremely unlikely that all Columbia and Snake River dams are going to come down. I mean, that's sort of many decades or even centuries ahead. But if you can find dams that are no longer serving a purpose, that are expensive to maintain, and that are will provide considerable ecological benefits if they come down, then we've got to get over that political hesitancy and do it. And just if you remember something from the book with those Elwha River dams, they came out because it was the best thing to do. They didn't come out because, oh well, one lobbying group won at the end of the day. They came out because they were expensive, they were dangerous. The people that owned the dams didn't want to keep operating them. And I think those circumstances probably apply to more dams than we think. And especially as time goes on, as dams reach an end of their useful life, they become incredibly expensive. And so I don't know enough about those 4 Snake River dams to say if they're anywhere close to that situation. But certainly it should be looked at. And if they are close to that situation, I think it might be nice to see that the sort of tide turn on those dams too.
That's interesting. Gracie, do we have time for any more questions?
Yeah, I think we can do one more and then I'll
Okay.
have one final one.
All right. Last question here from Victoria. She really enjoyed the discussion in the book about whether or not human intervention to save a species was correct or unnatural. Did you come to your own conclusion?
That is such a hard question to ask an environmental philosopher, because we spend all our times thinking about what's natural and does that go away if humans intervene too much? And it is a super difficult question. One thing I think I can say is that intervention today is more likely and perhaps more acceptable than it was in years gone by in the environmental movement. And that's because the world is more impacted today than it was before. I mean, that's just sort of a fact of population growth and a fact of the sort of influence of the things that we put out there in the environment. And so these ideas of sort of pristine nature that no one should intervene with, those ideas today are not what they were a century or a couple of centuries ago. Does that mean we have free rein to intervene wherever we want to make a change or think we can improve something that we should intervene? No, it doesn't mean that. Wilderness areas where interventions are kept at a minimum are a good thing. But I think it does open the door a little bit to the fact that we're likely to have to intervene smartly more and more as time goes on. And it's a very difficult question how to balance that, how to balance the times where you step back and how to balance that with the times that you step in. And one interesting lesson with my sort of perspective as someone from Europe, in Europe, which in some ways is a landscape that is already heavily intervened upon. In Europe, the rewilding movement is growing. It's just going gangbusters. Rewilding is this huge thing in Europe, even in England, where I grew up. So why is that? I think it's because people are kind of fed up with having landscapes that are thoroughly managed by people all the time. And they just want to step back and see what happens. And sometimes that's taking your farm and just selling your tractor and getting rid of your plow and then seeing what happens on the farm. And there's these incredible rewilding projects taking place at the moment in Europe on big landscapes and small landscapes. And I think even though I recognize that, as time goes on and there's more impacts and more people that we are going to be involved, with certain landscapes. There's also opportunities to step back. And there's also opportunities to let nature come back and let nature do its thing. And we don't always know what nature's going to do when we let it do its thing. But we know it's going to be something surprising, probably very interesting, and perhaps absolutely wonderful to look at. So I'd like to encourage that as much as I can.
Yeah, that's amazing. I feel like that's the whole kind of crux of the environmental philosophy, is like, how much do we as humans get ourselves involved in the environment, really. And something interesting, I remember someone said to you in the book, and I'm paraphrasing here a little bit, but when you zoom out, you see this one species on Earth, us humans, struggling to kind of like keep everyone else in place, all the other species. So how do you think that, or where do you think, or what do you think is the best way to kind of look at it? Is it that human and wildlife are this coupled system, as you mentioned? Is it kinship? Is it partnership? Is there even a best outlook?
Yeah, I mean, coupled, inevitably, we're on the same planet. You know, we're sharing this landscape with millions of species, and figuring out how to get along with them is probably a good idea. Like one of the things I say towards the end of the book is that biodiversity is like this kind of cushion around us, this sort of protective cushion. And our imperiled future, and this is a future imperiled by climate change, is going to be much safer if we're surrounded by intact biodiverse ecosystems that can continue to provide the ecological services that ecosystems have always provided. And so, you know, coupled, yes, we share this place. Let's share it as generously as we can. And where possible, let's step back and let's let animals do their thing, because we don't always know what they want to do or what's the best way to help them. We have to be humble about our knowledge of what animals need and want sometimes. So yeah, there's no sort of simple answer to a question like that, because the question has so many layers to it. But I do want to, you know, maybe as we're getting towards the end, just inject again this optimism about what can happen if we give it a chance to happen. We should really try and create those conditions and let it rip. You know, let's see what nature can do.
Yeah, I think that is a beautiful outlook. Thank you so much for joining us tonight, and for everyone on the call for joining us. I think that's a beautiful way to leave it. You know, this let us be courageous in the way that we can kind of trust other animals and other people in collaboration, in partnership, and kind of take our hands off the reins and, as you said, let it rip and see what beautiful things can come from it. So thank you everyone for joining. Have a great rest of your night.